Last week we had a discussion in Moodle about the emotional responses of art, and I just wanted to review a little information about each of the pieces that you looked at. This first image is called Saturn Devouring His Son by Francisco Goya, and it's clearly a very disturbing and maybe even confusing image. Goya was the one, if you'll remember last week, that we looked at. He had recorded 82 different images about the horrors of war that he had observed, civil war that he was witnessing in his country of Spain. This image itself, the mythology behind it, and we'll look a lot at mythology this semester in order to understand the iconography of an image, but the mythology behind this is that Saturn, when each of his children were born, if they were male children, he ate them for fear of being overthrown by them. And he did that because he had overthrown his own father. So he knew that through strength and perseverance, it was possible that his children would overthrow him. This was a Roman myth. And Goya would have seen an earlier image of this. This is an earlier image of the same mythology. This is Peter Paul Rubens from 1636, so about 200 years earlier, his Saturn Devouring His Son. So let's look at these images side by side now. So here we have the images side by side. On the left, we have Goya from 1819, and on the right, Peter Paul Rubens from 1636. Two subjects exactly identical, but the treatment of them is very different. So we're talking about the emotional effects of art and our responses to art emotionally. On the left, when we look at this horrible figure, it's a large figure. We assume that the figure of the sun here is a normal-sized person. So the figure of Saturn is massive in comparison, 3 or 4 times as large. Yet the look in his eyes is one of horror and fear and maybe even not fully understanding what he's doing. The figure's also a little grotesque. It doesn't really look like a normal man. Think about Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. This figure is just not fully right. The bony knees, the way he's positioned, crouching over like that, partially kneeling. It's not really the way a man stands. So we already know that something is wrong with this figure. Something's very wrong with this scene. And the disembodied figure we have here, it's almost harder to connect that to being a real human. It's almost like it's a doll that's being grasped by this large giant. In contrast to that, if we look on the right here, Peter Paul Rubens' Saturn Devouring His Son, this figure here of Saturn is really more the way we think of a god, that god in the sky, the Roman god, whatever god we're thinking about. An older man, long gray hair, carrying a staff. You can see these 3 stars in the background, probably a reference to Christianity, even though this is an image representing a Roman myth. Often when we see these 3 stars, it has to do with the Holy Trinity in Christianity. But the image here of this godlike person devouring what definitely more looks like a newborn baby. And they're in scale to each other. There's no sense of hierarchical scale that we see here, where this figure is so much bigger and so out of proportion to the figure of his son, his full-grown male son here. So, which is more horrific? That's something for us to think about. It's hard to say. One is grotesque. Well, they're both grotesque. One is probably more disturbing. This one here, Francisco Goya's piece. This here, it's hard to understand why this figure is doing this to its child. In sharp, sharp contrast to those images that elicit a sense of grotesqueness, we have Degas' dance class. This is from 1874. It was created for an impressionist exhibition, and at first sight, it's a room full of beautiful ballerinas. But as we look a little closer, we notice that most of the ballerinas are in slightly awkward, if not slightly strange poses. So let's start from the left here. This young woman is reaching up and scratching her back. This one here is playing with an earring. This is an older woman, an older ballerina, presumably there to help keep the girls in line, help teach classes. But she's not shown in a lovely, graceful stance. She's shown a little frumpy. All eyes are towards this young girl here. So she's really the only one shown in this moment of grace. As you look closely at the rest of the girls around the room, this one checking her strap on her shirt, this girl over here in an awkward stance, this one here fixing her headband. And then if we look all the way in the background here, there's a group of what we can assume are chaperones or parents. These young women would not have been allowed to just go to dance class. They would have had to have been chaperoned to keep things appropriate. So even though this image is of a very nice, very calm, middle-class scene of girls being trained in ballet, there's still a sense of a bit of chaos happening in the room, movement happening in the room. Kienholz's John Doe. You look at this and the first thought you have is probably, wow, that's strange. Here we'll start by looking at the bottom at this inscription. It says, riddle, why is John Doe like a piano? Answer, because he's square, upright, and grand. Old sooth saying. So this figure, John Doe, the artist does something by telling us or giving us a name. The name is John Doe. And we know from watching all these crime shows, John Doe is someone that doesn't have an identity. Often referenced as someone who is dead or maybe incarcerated. A body turns up and they don't have a full identity. So we are meant to see this and see a little bit of grotesqueness to it. So thinking back to Francisco Goya's piece, the figure is not meant to be lovely or pretty like that ballerina in the last slide. It is meant to stir up some emotions. Kienholz was very interested in commenting on values of society. So when we look at where this figure's heart should or might be, instead of a heart or a solid chest, we have this blown open, bleeding chest with a Christian cross on the inside of it. Kienholz was also really interested in being shocking and repulsive. And just looking at what this is comprised of, this is a type of collage, a three-dimensional collage, so it's a sculpture, and we'll often call them assemblages. So this assemblage is a doll torso inside of a little kid's stroller or pram. Edward Munch's The Scream, sometimes called the Shriek or the Cry, is a piece that right away, as soon as we see this, we think about disturbed images. We think about a sky being on fire. We think about even just the name kind of tightens us up and makes us not feel calm. Munch, when he had created this, I'm going to read what he had written on the back of one of the several paintings he did of this image. He painted this image over and over again. He was quite obsessed with it. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned over the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. When he created this image, he had been walking along, as he said, with friends, and it's thought there was a volcanic eruption that was not too far away from where he was. So it's thought that he did see the sky ablaze the way that he's talking about it. And he was very disturbed by this and became quite obsessed with this and quite obsessed with replicating this idea that nature was screaming. Mary Cassatt, a female painter. She was an American painter that did study in France for a period of time. This is called The Boating Party from 1893. She was really influenced by Japanese prints. So you can see here, there's big solid blocks of color. And as we get to know the Impressionist work a little better, we'll see that that's not very typical for Impressionist artists. Most Impressionist work has a lot of what you see in the water in the background here, and even maybe a little bit in her dress. A lot of combinations of colors to give you the essence of an overall color. You see a leisure activity happening. Again, just like we saw in Degas' dance class. This is a mother and her child, or maybe a nanny and her child, if you think it might not be a mom with her kid. So a middle-class woman taking care of a small child. And this looks like, to me, someone probably wearing a uniform. Somebody that's employed. This is not her partner. This is not her husband. This is not her friend. It's somebody she's paid to take her on a ferry ride. Maybe she's going from one area of the village to the other. Maybe she's going out to visit an island somewhere. But either way, she's having a leisurely afternoon. And we're meant to see it that way. We're meant to see this as a quiet, calming, leisurely activity. She would have been familiar with Manet's images like this. Manet was also an Impressionist painter that came slightly before her. This is called also The Boating Party. Lastly, we'll finish here with Van Gogh's Man with His Head in His Hands. And this image, just by the nature of the subject, initially makes us feel sorry for this person. So something tremendous, something overwhelming has happened to this older man. He looks like a stronger man. He's not a frail old man. He looks like he's got a straight back still. But we can tell from the way they've presented, that Van Gogh's presented his hair, that this is a man aging. He's dressed in blue from head to toe. Blue, a color that we always can associate with sadness or depression, coldness. But in sharp contrast to that, right next to this figure is the fireplace, burning, blazing brightly. And also when we look at his shoes, we see that he's got nice, clean boots on, and he's in a nice, clean, dry place, a nice, clean, dry seat. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy happening here. But the overwhelming sense, of course, is one of mourning, sadness. And we'll look in today's lecture at different ways that colors can convey emotion, and this is certainly one of them. And then thinking back to Munch's The Scream, the red of the fjord, creating a sense of agitation. This week's lecture, we're going to focus primarily on the visual elements, and we'll talk a little bit towards the end about Chapter 5, about evaluating art with words. So please do make sure that you read both Chapters 3, 4, and 5 in detail, but really focus on your Chapter 4 reading, as I will not be covering that in lecture this week. To begin, let's just look at some terms that we'll use a lot this semester, two-dimensional and three-dimensional. We talked about that really briefly when I gave you those 3 headings for what all art will fall under: pictures, sculpture, and architecture. So a two-dimensional surface, a plane that can be covered with visual elements, thinking about a piece of paper, a tapestry, a quilt, anything that lays flat. Three-dimensional objects are going to be and include the same visual elements. You're going to have texture and color and lines and all those other things, but they're not confined to a two-dimensional plane. They have a third dimension in them, such as in sculpture and architecture. The first example we're going to look at for these visual elements is Richter's OOA2. And this image we use because it contains so many of these elements: lines, mass, space, passage of time, motion, light, color, and texture. It is important to remember that not all of these are important or present in each piece of art, so we're not always going to be looking for each one of these things. So here, in Richter's piece, OOA2, let's start by looking at the background. So the background is a clearly undefined space. We do have a sense of horizon here when we look here. So we can see that this might be a tree line or something like that. And then this is the ground that this character is running on. I think the greatest thing that we can see and capture here is a sense of motion and passage of time. The figure's very clearly moving from left to right across the image. There's also a great bold use of color. So the figure that we're looking at is obviously all in black here, but the background, which would have came first, is in great drippy masses of color. The first of the many visual elements we'll look at this week is line. And lines are the basic building blocks for most of the art that we're going to look at this semester. So lines can contain color, can show us directionality, action, force, intersecting points. There are many characteristics of a line, and we'll watch a short video in a little bit called The Dot and the Line that really has a playful description of what we're going to talk about here. But there's many characteristics of a line. It can be active or static, aggressive or passive, sensual or mechanical, define boundaries, implying volume or mass. So now please watch this video, The Dot and the Line by Chuck Jones, 1965 short film. Please also watch Heather Hansen's Empty Gestures and then answer the questions on the next image. So how did Chuck Jones use line and color to tell a simple love story between the dot and the line? And how does Heather Hansen use lines to record her movements? And what is she recording? What do you think she's actually recording? Is it dance? Is it emotion? Is it energy? So a chance to do a little analysis here. Artists often use these two techniques when they're creating shape and depth, called hatching and stippling. And we'll look at the next slide to see what that is. But I just want to touch on this here. So hatching is putting lines close together. Cross-hatching is just laying those lines across each other. And stippling is using little dots, the closer together, showing more depth or shadow to an object. So here's a great example of hatching and cross-hatching. So you can see there's really not any other lines other than these short lines crossing each other at different points in order to create a sense of shading of her cheekbone, her eyebrow, under her nose. We've looked at lines, and now we're going to look briefly at shapes. Shapes are generally boundaries that are created using lines. There's a lot of different types of shapes, though. Some are geometric, so think about squares, triangles, rectangles. They're generally precise and regular, and they're common in the human-made world. Organic shapes curving, irregular, and rounded, are often made in the organic or natural world. And then we'll also look at what implied shapes are in art. So here, starting with an implied, this is Raphael's Madonna of the Meadows. And you can see Madonna, a small child right in front of her, and then another child to the left. So the Madonna, or the Virgin Mary, she's always going to be shown holding or with the Christ child. So if you see the Virgin, as we mentioned last lecture, if we see the Virgin holding a child, it's going to be Mary and baby Jesus. And if there's a third figure there, and that figure is a small child, often that's Jesus's cousin, John the Baptist. Often we'll see the Virgin Mary as the head of a triangle, and this is in Christianity a reference to, since there's 3 points of the triangle, again another little visual reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Catherine Gross's piece here, really moving into those organic forms when we talk about shapes. There's not a lot of recognizable shapes here, man-made shapes. These are all very organic and fluid shapes. And coming to Kandinsky to represent our geometric shapes. So these are not shapes that occur as readily in nature. Next, we'll be looking at space and time, or the passage of time. So peoples like the ancient Egyptians, their sense of space and perspective was one of seeing all space at the same time. So seeing all objects from their most recognizable point of view. And we'll see a lot of that when we look at ancient Egyptian art. This is a really great example of that pool in the garden from 1400 BCE. So the trees that would be, of course, standing upright are shown in their most recognizable view laying flat down next to this pool in the center. And same thing goes for the flora and fauna in the pool here. We have animals and plants, ducks, fish, and some papyrus reeds in the pool. And they're all shown from a view we can recognize them the most. Some of the methods that we use to imply depth as artists are using overlapping objects. So an object in the front will clearly be closer than an object that is behind something else. Diminishing size, so things getting smaller as they're further away. Or vertical placement, where an object that's close and low in the picture will be shown as larger, and an object that's high and further away will be shown as smaller. So here are some examples of using overlapping images to show things being further away or closer. Here in Cézanne's Still Life with Apples, even though the objects in the back are further away, they're still the same size. So he's using that overlapping of objects method. The Renaissance artists used something called perspective and linear perspective, and that's really a language that most artists will still use today to imply depth. So linear perspective often has a vanishing point, and here is that 1 point perspective. So way far away on the horizon, you can see right where I have this little laser dot, everything gets smaller as it moves towards that vanishing point. Another method that's used is 2 point perspective, where there are 2 vanishing points. And you can think of this if you're looking down the corner of a building. This will make sense. So if you're standing at the corner of one of the buildings on Centenary's campus, and you're looking to the right, and you're looking to the left, the further away the windows get, the smaller they become. So here in Raphael's The School of Athens, they are using a 1 point perspective. So way off in the distance, which we're not even shown, it's so far away, is that one vanishing point. And all the lines in this room are leading to that point. And we can see that a little more clearly here with the figures removed. So think of this as that great roadway diminishing in the distance to this vanishing point. Another example of this one-point perspective is this image that we're all very familiar with, Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Artists will also use time and motion frequently in their images. Here we're going to see the passage of time marked by one figure appearing in several different places in an image. So here is St. Anthony and St. Paul meeting right at the bottom of the frame here. But what we don't see right away is that here is St. Anthony making his journey. So here he begins his journey, he's walking around this large hillside, he's meeting what looks like a beggar at the edge of a wood, and eventually he walks down to the mouth of this cave. And we're supposed to understand that this is a journey that took place over time. And then here at the mouth of the cave, here he's meeting St. Paul. The Eaglin brothers racing here, this is another sense of passage of time. We see these two brothers in linear motion gliding across the water. We know that they're in motion. Their bodies are in the middle of an action. And we can see those motion lines here. One thing about, just to mention briefly, about this horizontal action, this horizontal movement that's happening. Often horizontal movement, so movements across a horizon line, such as these, are often calming, and even though there's a lot of action happening, they're very stilling images. When we look at images like this, the raft of Medusa, there's a lot of forward and upward energy happening, so upward thrusting of motion. We do again have a great sense of time and movement. The waves are in the process of crashing. These people are in the process of dying and falling off the raft. So same feeling of motion that we saw in the Eaglin brothers racing, but here we have a very vertical movement. All these figures are thrusting upward and are very vertical. And in contrast to the horizontal motion of the Eaglin brothers racing, this vertical motion gives us a sense of upset and of duress. And we also see that here. This is Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. This is an image we'll look at quite a bit this semester. Again, with that vertical movement, even though the figures are marching forward, our sense of time and space, everything's a little jumbled and a little overwhelming. Some artists use actual motion in their works, and those are often going to be three-dimensional sculptural pieces of art. First we'll look at here is Alexander Calder's one of his untitled pieces, and this is considered kinetic art, meaning that motion is a major feature of the work. So here these large mobiles hang in these wonderful spaces. This was at the original Barnes Foundation right outside of Philadelphia. And these kites in the sky here, they're going to be influenced by air movement, doors opening and closing. So they have a bit of a mind of their own. This artist, this is Nick Cave, and I'll have you stop and watch this video shortly, but this is one of Nick Cave's sound suits. And you'll see in this video that Nick Cave uses time and motion and the energy of the people that wear his sound suits to transfer the energy of a moving body into the energy of these pieces of art he's created. So please stop now and watch Nick Cave's sound suit video in your video links. When we talk about light and dark, we're often talking about something called value or tone. Talking about light and dark and all the shades of gray in between here, we can look at a value scale. And on the left here we have complete white, and this is considered high value or the highest value. And on the right here we have black, or the darkest value, the lowest value. Beneath this here we can see the relationship of light and dark. So this gray bar in the middle here is actually one continuous color. And what this is showing us is that the contrast of the colors is what gives us the illusion of color, or the contrast of the shades here. So on the left here, where we have a very high value background, this gray looks really dark. And on the right hand side, where we have a very low value background, this gray looks a lot lighter. In this next slide, Rosa Boher's Harvest Season, we'll see a lot of the different values from light to dark. And we'll see this artist using a technique called chiaroscuro, which is really showing a harsh contrast of light and dark next to each other in order to create mass and shading. So looking at the underbelly of these great beasts here, we see their faces and backs illuminated by the sun, and even these workers up top here with their hay on the wagon illuminated by the sun. And then in order to show the mass and hulk and the direction of the sun's perspective here, the whole underside of these animals is almost completely blacked out for the viewer in order to show us how heavy how heavy these animals are. This is one of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches here. You can see that he used a lot of hatching and cross-hatching in order to accomplish this beautiful study that he did for a later painting. And we mentioned earlier, just to talk about the iconography before we talk about this in the scheme of light and dark, we talked that if we see the Virgin Mary or a woman holding a small child, we can often assume that's the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus or Christ child. If there is another child present, that's going to be Saint John the Baptist, which is one of Jesus's cousins and a very important player in early Christian iconography and mythology. And in this case, there's another figure in the background here. This is the figure of Saint Anne. This is the Virgin Mary's mother. So we have 3 generations, 1, 2, 3 generations of Christ's genealogy. And now looking at this from a perspective of light and dark, just like we saw in the last slide, there's a great use of chiaroscuro here, so showing light contrasted against dark in order to show bulk of a form. A lot of these figures' faces, so here the side of the Virgin Mary, and even a huge part of St. Anne's face, are shrouded in darkness or shrouded in a low value, so a great deal of black concentrated in order to help us get a sense of form, shape, and depth. As we begin to talk about color, I'd like for you to watch these 2 videos, the first Intro to Color Theory and the second Bill Nye the Science Guy's video about color. I've also posted a link to an extra credit that you can do, so you can listen to Radiolab's Color podcast. It's about an hour long and it's really wonderful. You put it on in the car as you drive, and you can write a short reflection about that and submit that to me via email. This is the color wheel, and we use this to help us organize and understand color. Our 3 primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. When we mix these primary colors, we get what we call secondary colors. So when we mix blue with yellow, we get green, blue with red, we get violet, and red with yellow, we get orange. When we mix a primary and a secondary color, we get what we call tertiary colors. So yellow and orange produces yellow-orange, yellow and green produces yellow-green, and so forth. When we think about complementary colors, so colors that work together, and these are often colors when we think about fashion or design that we can look at, they'll be opposite each other on the color wheel. So complementary colors are opposite one another on the color wheel. So this yellow-green is going to go well with red-violet, red-orange will look good with blue-green. So not that these are the only colors they'll look good with, but these are considered complementary or the best and most harmonious fit of colors. So just to review here, primary, red, yellow, and blue, secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, and intermediate colors. I think if I asked you what colors would make you feel hot or colors that would make you feel cold, you'd pretty quickly give me these two colors. Red for making you feel hot or warm, and blue for making you feel cool or cold. And these colors can have a psychological effect as well. So when we think about Edvard Munch's The Scream, where that fjord is on fire and the man in the foreground, looking a little skeleton-like, is holding his face in terror, that swirling red sky to us definitely elicits agitation. When we look at this next image here, this blue filled with cool colors, this is actually what we call monochromatic, meaning a very, very restricted color palette. So mono meaning one or single use of color. So these are all considered different shades of blue. When we look at this, it has a lot more of a cooling or often calming effect on us, even though the image itself is a little strange and agitating, very surrealist with all the little people in the background and body parts morphing out. This is an image, a painting of Paul Revere, one of the heroes of the Revolutionary War. And it's done primarily in what we call a restricted color palette. So when we look at these colors here, we see brown, white, black, shades of tan, but not a lot of bold color on either end of the spectrum. We've reviewed a lot about the emotional effects of specific pieces of art, and now we've talked briefly about the emotional effects of color. I'd like for you to do a quick jot down for me now. What are the emotional effects on you of this piece? Is it uplifting? Is it sad? What mood does it elicit for you? And beyond that, I want you to just take a chance, and I want you to see if you can decipher maybe a little bit about what you're looking at, what's going on in this image. I'd also like for you to take another look at this image. This is Munch's The Scream. This was part of your discussion board last week. And I want you to visit it now from a perspective of knowing a little more about it. So at the beginning of the lecture, I talked specifically about this piece, and then also just in looking at color and the impact of color. So just do a jot now. And see if anything else jumps out at you about this piece that maybe you didn't think of before. Or maybe your feelings, your initial impact feelings about this piece are just further reinforced. Our last visual element is texture. And texture can be either simulated symbolically, so implying texture through painting, or actual texture, where we are encouraged to actually touch and interact with an object that has a more sensory nature to it. And this is a good example of that actual texture. This is Merritt Oppenheim's object, Breakfast in Fur from 1936. Merritt Oppenheim was a feminist artist, and this was really for her a commentary about women of leisure who had time to wear fur coats and drink tea. And through it, we're encouraged to think about what it would feel like in order for us to pick up this cup and bring it to our mouth. So she's encouraging us to think about the actual texture of this object. In contrast to that, we'll look at this next image, Starry Night, an image you're all very familiar with. And Van Gogh uses a technique called impasto. And here we see that impasto, very thick, heavy brush strokes, often put on with a heavy palette knife. So rather than using a paintbrush, using a little knife to apply paint to a canvas, and we're meant to see this texture as very representative of movement and motion. One of the goals of this course is to have you have a significantly stronger language in which to talk about art. And one of the ways that we learn to talk about art is by understanding different methods of art criticism. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of basic theories about how to talk about art. But really, for our purposes, for the purposes of this course, we'll focus on three of them: formal, contextual, and expressive. And formal, the way I want you to think about that is when an artist makes a piece of art, who else is working around them? Who's influencing them? How did they come up with the ideas that they're using, the techniques that they're using? What previous artists' work are they building upon? And we'll look at an example. Look at both Titian's Pietà, where Titian uses innovative brushwork in order to build this new image. And we'll look at Turk's simultaneous contrasts, where she was greatly influenced by Cubism, but took it to another level. So here's Titian's Pietà. He painted this in 1575, right at the end of his life and the end of his painting career. And in comparison to the other artists at the time, you can see here, see how the edges are really soft? It almost looks like it's done out of chalk more than done out of fine oil paintings or fine tempera painting. What he's done is he's applied a more painterly or looser use of brush strokes here. So we look at this from a formal perspective. We're looking at this in relation to other artists working at the time and the artist's other work at the time. Turk's simultaneous contrast, she was working during and slightly after the period of Cubism, where art was broken down largely into geometric forms. But instead of those forms overlapping, they're separated out from one another, which was a bit of an innovation over the other people working in similar styles at the same time. And here we'll look at Basquiat's horn players from also a formal perspective. Basquiat was living in New York City in the 80s, and he was surrounded by the new movement of graffiti. So when we look at his work and look at the other type of artwork that is coming just before him and is there for him to be looking at as mentor work, he was very heavily influenced by graffiti, and we can clearly see that here in his work. Formal is probably the most difficult type of criticism to do as someone that maybe doesn't know a lot about art movements or the artist's full body of work, all the work they've done during their life. Contextual criticism will be a lot easier and more approachable for us for this semester. So what contextual is it's thinking about the influences on a work of art. So not thinking about the other painting that's happening at the time, but thinking about what's going on culturally, politically, what is happening surrounding this person that's creating this piece of art. A great example of that is the Pietà. So he painted this piece during a period of plague and mourning, mortality, death, and grief. And when we look at the image, we can really see. Here, looking at Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People from a contextual point of view. This was a region of France that was heavily influenced by the post-revolutionary France. So the French had a very large revolution in the 1780s, just like we did here in the United States, our American Revolution. And the images and the rebuilding that were still happening as a result of coming out of this period of time, as well as continued internal conflict that Delacroix would have been witnessing here, still poor people suffering and the rich still getting richer. This image represents, this image of this woman here, she represents somebody leading these people out of this darkness that they've been inside of. So in looking at this from the contextual point of view, we're seeing these people that are surrounded by post-war suffering, and we're seeing a sense of hope needed here. So Delacroix is painting this and is very heavily influenced by what has been happening surrounding him. And lastly, and probably most accessibly, the expressive theory of art criticism. Who made it and who is she or he? And generally, this is really knowing personally about a person's life. So looking at that last image, Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, we didn't really need to know much about Delacroix as a painter, as a person, as a father, a son, a child, a teacher. None of that really mattered. We looked at it from the contextual point of view, what was happening surrounding him, this post-explosive revolutionary world he was living in. We look at things from an expressive point of view. We're looking at it from the point of view of why did the person do this? Why is this important? Why is this valuable to this person? So looking back at Pietà, again, that first image we saw of Titian, like I mentioned, this was painted in the last years of Titian's life. His health was failing, his career was declining, and the image itself, the somber reflection of mortality that we see with Mary cradling Jesus and everyone looking on, it's a very sad and very life-draining scene. This is a painting by a woman named Frida Kahlo. It's called The Two Fridas, and it was painted in 1936. Frida was the child of a German man and a Mexican woman, and her whole life she felt like she battled between these two identities. So in this portrait of the two Fridas, on the left-hand side, we see Frida as a European woman in a fine European dress, and on the right-hand side as a Mexican woman in very traditional Mexican clothing, which is typically what she wore. Her husband was a very famous Mexican painter named Diego Rivera, and he really encouraged her to dress this way. So the Frida on the left is cutting her heart out. It's not complete and it's torn open. And the Frida on the right has a complete and intact heart, and in her hand she holds a very small portrait of her husband Diego, who had just passed away at the time that she had painted this. So as you can see from an expressive theory of art criticism, when you know a little bit of background about the artist, it really helps you to decipher information about the piece and can be a really easy way to deeply connect with pieces of art. Hope you enjoy your week, students. There will not be a video recorded lecture for next week or the following week, but there will be a PowerPoint posted that has several short videos that you will need to watch and respond to. So please look out for those for weeks 4 and 5. Wishing you the best week.